Tony Beets built his empire by owning the land. Parker Schnabel built his by owning the gold. This is the wealth and land battle for the Klondike, and only one of them can stand as the true winner. So who actually comes out on top? Today, we'll explore their stories, feats, and biggest achievements to find out who really deserves to be called King of the Klondike. And if you think you already know the answer, then stick around, because you, like many others, are in for a huge surprise. Tony Beets, the man who bought the game. We'll begin with the man who owned the land, but grew up on a farm in the Netherlands milking cows every morning before school. Tony Beets' story doesn't start in the Klondike. It starts somewhere with no gold, no mining, and no reason to believe any of this was coming. Just a small village called Weidines, flat green land, cold mornings, and a family that worked with their hands because there was nothing else to do. But all of that was about to change. In 1984, he packed up, flew to Canada, landed in Dawson City, and took a job running heavy equipment. He had no mining background, no money, and no connections worth mentioning. He worked construction for 3 years, and during that time, something shifted. He found his passion for mining, and on his own, he started digging. This is where his life took a huge turn. Unlike most miners in the Klondike who explored and extracted by digging and collecting, Tony took a completely different approach. While everyone around him was thinking about gold, Tony was thinking about land. His philosophy was simple but ruthless. Mining could make you rich, but owning the land made you untouchable, because the land came with the gold, and everyone was willing to dig for it. So when any crew came to him with a lease agreement, they handed him a cut of whatever they pulled out. He'd collect at cleanup while they handled the fuel bills, the broken equipment at 2 in the morning, the mud, the cold, and the machines that quit without warning. All Tony had to do was wait. He built that model piece by piece, claim by claim, and slowly but surely across some of the richest ground in the entire Yukon. Paradise Hill became his main base. Then he got to Eureka Creek. While other miners were grinding through one brutal season after another, Tony was quietly becoming the man those miners had to call when they needed somewhere to dig. His royalty deals were the engine behind all of it. When his own son Kevin ran the Scribner Creek claim, Tony still took 10% of every ounce Kevin pulled out of the ground. Kevin paid the bills and managed the crew. Tony collected the check, and it worked. But land was only half of what Tony was building. The other half was something most in the Klondike would have called a bad idea. In Season 5, Tony Beets paid $1 million for a gold dredge sitting broken and rusted on Clear Creek, 150 miles from his main claim at Paradise Hill. This machine had not run in at least 40 years. It weighed 350 tons, was built in 1939, and from the outside it looked less like mining equipment and more like someone had turned a small factory into a boat. The process works by floating on a pond it creates itself, scooping up gravel with a long chain of steel buckets, running everything through a wash system built inside the hull and spitting out useless rock while keeping the gold. When running clean, one dredge moves in a single minute what a crew of 3 men working all day could not match. Tony had watched wash plants break down and stop entire operations cold, and he wanted something that ran at a different scale entirely. Getting it there took 6 full months. His crew dismantled it piece by piece, loaded everything onto trucks, hauled it 150 miles across rough roads, and rebuilt the entire machine from scratch on the new pond. When they finally tried to float it, the hull took on water. So he drained the pond, fixed the leak, and started the bucket chain again. Once fully running, that dredge was pulling 2,000 gallons of water through its system every single minute, processing ground at volumes no wash plant in the Klondike could come close to matching. It was his ground, his machine, and nobody else's name on the check. On paper, no one in the Klondike who could compete with that. But just 3 hours south, a young man was quietly building something that would contend with Tony's influence for years to come. Parker Schnabel, the kid who refused to lose. Now, let's get to the man who ran a full mining operation before he was legally old enough to get a drink. Born on July 22, 1994, in Haines, Alaska, Parker Schnabel thrived in a small town of a few thousand people sitting between the mountains and the water at the very bottom of the region. But many things made Parker stand out among the rest. For example, his grandfather John Schnabel confirmed that by the time Parker was 5 years old, he was already climbing into the cab of heavy equipment at the Big Nugget mine near Porcupine Creek and doing things he at first found concerning. According to John Schnabel, young Parker was not watching or standing nearby, but actually trying to operate. His grandfather was intrigued by this and decided to start handing responsibilities at the facility to Parker with each passing year. At this point, John had started the Big Nugget mine and turned it into one of the most well-known small gold operations in Alaska, and he had now passed everything he knew directly to Parker through those summers at the mine. The problem was that Parker was still young, so he waited until he turned 16 years old in 2010 before handing him full control of the Big Nugget operation. At only 16 years old, Parker was now running a real mining crew, managing real equipment, making real decisions about where to dig and how deep to go. Parker ran Big Nugget for 2 seasons. He showed up in Season 2 of Gold Rush alongside his grandfather and quickly became one of the people viewers were intrigued by, not because of the cameras, but because of what he actually did with the equipment for someone his age. By the end of Season 3, Big Nugget had run thin. The ground was giving less and less, and Parker had already started looking north for bigger dreams and better returns. And that was when he made the decision that changed the trajectory of his life. It was 2013. He had just turned 18, and he made the tough call not to go to college. The fund his family saved for his tuition was going into mining equipment instead. Without looking back, he packed up, drove north across the border into the Yukon, and leased over 300 acres of gold-bearing land at Scribner Creek. It was 33 miles southeast of Dawson City, sitting right at the point where Scribner Creek meets the Indian River. This land belonged to none other than Tony Beets. The Season 4 premiere aired on October 25, 2013, and the whole country watched Parker show up on someone else's ground with used equipment and a plan that a lot of people thought was going to fail horribly. How he proved them wrong was very interesting. And better yet, he did it in a way that amazed Tony. But he first started by signing a contract with him. For every ounce his crew dug out of the ground, cleaned, and weighed at the end of a hard week, Tony collected 10%. Yet it didn't stop there. Once Parker hits 1,500 ounces in a season, that number jumps to 15%. When he crosses 2,000 ounces, Tony's cut rises to 20. Push past 3,000 in a single season, and the royalty hits 25%. Tony carried zero risk, and Parker carried all of it, from the fuel to run the excavators, the wages for the crew, and the massive fixing costs. On top of that, the equipment Parker started with was far from impressive. He bought the Little Blue wash plant off the Hoffman crew, a set of people who were selling everything after their own failed attempt at the Klondike. He got their beat-up D10 dozer along with used gear all worn down and bought cheap because that was all the college fund could afford. He also picked up a 363 YAO hopper feeder to keep Little Blue running. Tony had been doing this for 30 years. Parker had just turned 18. And somehow it wasn't a contest, at least not yet. For now, though, Parker's system was not built to last under pressure. He had pushed Little Blue past its limit trying to hit his numbers, and the shaker drive shaft snapped. The plant went down, and he had to rent Big Red from another miner just to finish the season. He managed to pull it off as planned, and at the end of that first season on Tony's ground, Parker Schnabel had pulled 1,029 ounces of gold out of Scribner Creek. The total was worth $1.4 million. That number broke the record that Todd Hoffman had spent 4 full seasons trying to build, and Parker pulled it off by himself in 1 year at 18 years old. But he didn't want to celebrate. Every dollar Parker kept after paying Tony's royalty went straight back into the ground. He needed better equipment, a tighter operation, and better ways of compounding his earnings. Given the circumstances, getting comfortable on someone else's land was the one mistake he could not afford to make back then. He was planning to leave soon, but not now. So when Season 5 started, Parker returned to Scribner Creek, coming back early in May of that year to start melting the frozen ground before the mining season officially opened. Tony's new contract for that year allowed Parker to keep working on his land, but on one condition: install hydraulic riffles into Big Red. Parker installed them and got back to work, pushing into the swamp cut. a stretch of ground previous miners had walked away from 20 years earlier because the gold barely covered the cost of getting it out. Now he was going there for the gold, and the wash plant sat a full mile from the cut, meaning that every rock truck burned diesel on a long round trip. Not wanting that to get in his way, Parker moved Big Red half a mile closer and kept going rather than walking away from ground everyone else had already given up on. This went on for 2 whole years, and by season 7, Parker had mapped the contract so precisely that he knew exactly where to stop. 3,000 ounces was the wall. Cross it, and Tony's share jumped to 25%, meaning 1 in every 4 ounces Parker dug up would go to Tony. Parker cut his crew to 9 people and set a deliberate ceiling on production. The entire staff was now cut down to 9 people running heavy equipment through one of the harshest and most remote work environments in North America. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was at least a 3-hour drive away. That season, he had just turned 22, while Tony Beets had been mining the Klondike for over 30 years. Parker finished under 3,000 ounces, protecting his margin and reinvesting everything. He kept building toward the day he would never need to sign another man's lease again, and he would eventually succeed. So without further ado, let's now compare their greatest feats and achievements. Their greatest feats and achievements. To give a fair comparison, we have to fully consider everything that happened with Parker after 2013. All the events that led up to the big showdown in 2016 and where they both stand today in terms of wealth and power. As early as 2014, Parker Schnabel had already stopped being the kid paying rent and started being the man who owned the operation. He registered Little Flake Mining as his own company, moved off Tony's Scribner Creek ground, and started running his own claims without royalties. Tony built an empire, and Parker just decided to build his own. The name was simple, but the ambition behind it was not. And as far as he thought, he was not building a one-season operation, but something that would still be standing in at least 30 years from then. But to pull that off, he needed to run it differently from every other miner in the Klondike. Tony Beets, on the other hand, ran on volume and gut. He had been doing this since before Parker was born, and his instincts were built on decades of watching ground pay out and dry up. Owning the land over mining directly has been the approach that has worked for 40 years. It made him the most powerful landowner in the Dawson City district, but Parker took a completely different approach. And the strength of his approach only began to show during Season 10 in 2019, when Parker posted a public job listing for a productivity advisor at Little Flake Mining. The description asked for someone with a head for numbers, someone who could think in systems, track truck movements, measure fuel consumption against output, and find the small leaks in a big operation that nobody else was looking for. It was a strange job offer. Not a miner or a mechanic needed on site, but a person whose only job was to find where time and money were disappearing and stop it from happening. Parker was treating his gold mine the way a factory manager treats a production floor. He wanted every haul road optimized, every shift timed, and every piece of equipment watched for signs it was costing more than it was making. The gap between running at 80% efficiency and 95% efficiency across an operation burning $250,000 a day is not a rounding error. All operations cost millions of dollars a season, and Parker was the first miner in the Klondike to go looking for it with that level of focus. After everything from the royalties, the setbacks, and crews walking off it all came down to one season for Parker to finally surpass Tony. And the result surprised everyone. But for now, Tony's empire kept growing the old way with little effort. He now had plants at Indian River with his 350-ton dredge. His son Kevin ran Scribner Creek under a 10% royalty agreement that still flowed money back to Tony at every cleanup. His other son Mike was working at Paradise Hill. His wife Minnie was managing the books. The whole Beets family deployed across multiple claims simultaneously, each one producing and sending a percentage of their incomes back to the top. Unlike Parker, Tony did not need to be everywhere or anywhere on some days. With workers on site and a family working around the clock, Tony had built a system where the land worked for him whether he was standing on it or not. But that was until a major disaster struck and changed everything. When Season 16 kicked off, Tony's Slucifer wash plant at Indian River caught fire when its 40-horsepower drive motor burned through its own wiring and shut down. The entire plant was down for 4 days, And by the time his crew bypassed the system with a generator 4 times more powerful than the one that failed, the operation had already lost an estimated $340,000 in production. Tony's response was to hotwire the whole system and get back to work. As fast as possible, he wanted to fix it and get back on the gold. The dredge that same season sat idle for 6 weeks because there was no thawed ground beneath it to process. But Tony dragged it across the raised bedrock using 2 D7 dozers on heavy cables to reposition it closer to a viable gold source. When it finally restarted, it produced 31 ounces of gold in 3 days, costing about $83,000 shortly before a leaking pontoon shut it down again. But Parker's operation did not run that way. When a motor part failed on Big Red in the final weeks of season 16, Parker did not wait for a truck to bring it from Whitehorse. He owned a Cessna 172 and kept a full-time pilot on staff specifically for moments like this. His crew member Jack Frischkorn flew out, picked up the part, and brought it back in time to keep the plant running before the first snowfall ended the season. That one decision, owning an aircraft as an operational tool rather than a luxury, was the difference between a plant running its final days and a plant sitting cold while debt kept climbing. Then in 2023, Parker paid $15 million for 400 mining claims at Dominion Creek. 10,000 acres. Geological surveys estimated 80,000 ounces of recoverable gold sitting under that ground. At $2,500 per ounce, there was at least $200 million in gold waiting to be dug up. The gold price of season 16 was $4,000 an ounce, and that same reserve was now worth $320 million. Parker put $5 million down and structured the remaining $10 million as seller financing, paying it back at roughly $3.5 million each year. He was carrying a debt load that would have crushed most operations, running it along with daily burn rates of $100,000 to $250,000, while chasing a season goal of 10,000 ounces across 4 wash plants at once. When we compare that with Tony's, things start to get a lot more interesting. For one, Tony's land portfolio is wider. He holds more total acres of land across the Dawson City District, with vast properties spread across Paradise Hill, Indian River, Eureka Creek, and the Scribner Creek ground, which Kevin runs under his father's royalty structure. Tony's ground was bought earlier, at a lower cost, with no seller financing sitting on top of it. His balance sheet carries less pressure. That is a real advantage, and it is not a small one. But Parker has yet another hidden advantage. Dominion Creek was 40 feet of frozen ground sitting on top of gold that nobody could reach before Parker showed up to move it. Smaller operators, including some of the same people who lease ground from Tony, cannot get to that pay layer. They simply do not have the machines or the cash flow to run it. The ground itself keeps them out, and Parker Schnabel owns every inch of it. Yet that was only the beginning. In season 16, 7 members of Tony's crew walked off his operation mid-season and drove to Parker's camp. This was not because Parker paid them more on the spot, because his operation was organized, and Tony's was not giving them what they needed. Kevin Beets found out when he went to start his week at Scribner Creek that his crew was gone. Parker absorbed them without slowing down, and the season ended with Tony Beets at 11,231 ounces, marking the first time in his career that he had ever crossed 10,000. Parker finished at 10,596 ounces, worth $42 million. The gap between them at the final weigh-in was 635 ounces. At $4,000 an ounce, that is $2.5 million. Tony won season 16. For the first time in his best season of a 40-year career, he beat Parker Schnabel. And Parker said, sitting across from Tony in Dawson City with a drink in his hand and the season finally over, "I can't have you finding more than us." So, with all that said, let's proceed to answer the big question of this video. Who is the king of the Klondike? The answer is simple. Parker Schnabel is the future, but Tony Beets is still the present. He won season 16 with 11,231 ounces, the first time in 40 years of mining that he ever crossed 10,000. He did it with a family crew, a dredge that kept breaking, and ground he bought decades ago at a fraction of what Parker just paid for Dominion Creek. He carries no seller financing. His land generates royalty income from other miners, including his own son. And at 68 years old, he just had the best season of his entire career. As we've said, Parker Schnabel is the future. Tony is still the present, yet all that separated his 40 years of experience from the future of the Klondike was a narrow win of 600 ounces. Now, let's discuss below. Are you Team Parker or Team Tony? Do you disagree with our conclusions? We'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Global Status for more videos like this. Also consider checking out other videos on the channel if you enjoyed this. Until next time, take care.